Respected Principal Dr. Wagisi Joshua, Speaker of the Day Dr. A.V. Koshi, Head of the Department Professor Senior Rachel Matthew, Program Coordinators, faculty, and all the participants, a very warm good afternoon to one and all. We begin with our second day of the Practical Critic. Before we commence with the workshop, let me tell you a few guidelines to keep in mind. The sessions will be streamed only through the YouTube link each day. The feedback link will be shared in the Google Classroom and WhatsApp, from where registered participants can access it. E-certificates will be given to those participants who have 90% attendance and have submitted the practical criticism paper on or before November 30th. Kindly place your questions only in the YouTube chat box and refrain from commenting in the chat box. Kindly enter your details correctly in the form. No corrections will be entertained later. These would be the instructions for the day. Today we'll be having a session on the topic Practical Criticism and Literary Forms. The keynote speaker of the day is Dr. A.V. Koshi, who is working as an assistant professor in Johnson University. An eminent personality, Dr. A.V. Koshi is more than perfect for today's session. He has engineered more than 5 creative writing courses on reading and writing. Now I request Professor Anju Kurian to say a few words of welcome.
Hope I'm audible.
Yes, Miss.
Yeah. Good afternoon to all. Literary criticism is about waking up to a critical consciousness to by lighting up the critical spirit. Different literary forms opens up avenues through which the reader encounters relational standpoints with which a text engages with history, politics, society, economy, and culture. So here we are on the second day of our workshop, The Practical Critic. Today, we are privileged to have with us Dr. A.V. Koshi, who is a teacher at the Jasin University in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, working at the Department of English. Dr. Koshi is a dynamic researcher, a teacher of culture, stylistics, and theater. I take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Koshi, our keynote speaker, into our midst. The convener of this course, Dr. Apu Jacob John, has put in tireless efforts in the materialization of this workshop, and the director of today's course is Dr. Anju Shoshin George. For the sake of formality, I welcome both to this in-house program. We are honored to have participants from across the country for this program. I welcome each and every one, the teachers, the research scholars, and students attending this session. Welcome all once again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now I would like to invite Dr. Anju Shoshan George, the course director of the session, to introduce the speaker of the day.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I am audible.
Yes, miss, you are audible.
Allegories to ballads, essays to erotica, fables to fiction, nursery rhymes to epics, limericks, elegies, comedies, tragedies, and many, many more. These forms are as diverse as the human being who is just trying to reflect. But is the vessel that holds the wine as relevant as the wine itself? Definitely. Today we hope to learn more of this. It is with joy that I introduce our speaker for the day, Dr. A.V. Koshi, who is an assistant professor at the Department of English at Jasin University, Saudi Arabia. Sir is interested in creative writing and editing and has run multiple creative writing courses at the Srishti School of Art, Design and Technology. He's also the creator and founder for the Autism for Help Village Project Trust. So we welcome you with great delight and look forward to an engaging session. There are certain things for the participants to remember regarding the course, particularly the assignment. You need to prepare a paper on practical criticism, apply it to a text. It could be from any prose, poetry, or drama. The word limit would be of 500 words. Your article should be crisp, that would cover the diverse aspects of practical criticism. And the last date of submission for this would be 30 November 2020. You need to upload the text that you're going to review and your practical criticism paper in the Google form that will be provided to you. Your paper, after the review from the panel, would be published in a book with ISBN. And regarding the certificates would be released from December 1st on a 90% attendance and the submission of the practical criticism paper. If you have any questions or queries, they can be posted at the live YouTube chat. Kindly do not post queries on attendance in the same. Once again, we welcome everyone to the day 2 of Practical Criticism, Literary Forms by Dr. A.V. Koshi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Before we start with the lecture, let me tell you a few guidelines to keep in mind. The sessions will be streamed only through the YouTube links each day. The feedback link will be shared in the Google Classroom and WhatsApp, from where registered participants can access it. E-certificates will be given only to those participants who have 90% attendance and have submitted the practical criticism paper on or before November 30th. Kindly place your questions in the YouTube chat box and refrain from commenting in the chat box. Kindly enter your details correctly in the forms. No corrections will be entertained later. These are all the instructions for the day. Without any further delay, here begins today's session. May I invite Dr. A.V. Koshi to give us all an outlook about practical criticism and literary forms. So please, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm very happy to address CMS College Kottayam. It's a college that I have some connection with. I think that I will, go directly into the topic. Now, if you know about it, there is a paper called Introduction to Literary Forms in most universities, many universities in the world, especially in the Middle East. And it comes in the 3rd or 4th or 5th semester for what Americans call the undergraduate course, or what Indians call the graduate course, the Bachelor of Arts for Literature. So I thought that I will take that as my starting point. So the first part of my talk will deal with going into the different varieties of accepted literary forms that are taught across the world. I thought of being offbeat and going into what many people are discussing as forms now. But although I am always offbeat, I always stay off the beaten track. I am not mainstream because there's nothing called the mainstream anymore. There are only subcultures. But I thought that to satisfy my audience who come from more kind of a mainstream setup, this should be my starting point. So just to start with, literature is traditionally divided probably I should define literature first. Literature is defined in two different ways. There's a broad definition whereby some people say anything that is written can be called literature. But others know that this is also a temporary definition. We live in and we have to hold provisionally all definitions nowadays. For example, this does not really take into consideration concepts like, what do you call something that is spoken? Or what do you call something that is text that you watch? I'll come to the technical terms 1 or 2 minutes back. In fact, this is one of the oldest debates in the history of Western literature. In the book called Phaedrus by Plato, there is a discussion between Socrates and another person. It's a series of dialogues, and the discussion is about whether you should privilege, to use modern terminology, speech over writing or writing over speech. And Socrates is of the opinion that speech should be privileged over writing. But many years later, in the 20th century, Derrida unpicked or unpacked this argument by saying that we remember this argument only because it was written down by Plato in Phaedrus. So the argument works against itself, and writing is indirectly, subconsciously, subtly, or unconsciously even, to Socrates or Plato, privileged thereby in the text over speech. And in other words, the text is at odds with itself. There's a pull between two forces, that are contrapuntal. Now, this is to speak theory, but let me come back to the definition of literature. So in literature, we speak of literature as, the body of written work. That's one definition. That excludes the oral or the visual elements. But then a later understanding or refinement of literature is, connecting it to value. You speak of it in terms of value. That is, linguistically it is superior to other kinds of writing, or as language, grammatically, semantically, hermeneutically, or it is superior in terms of form or structure, or because it brings in, or is considered the epitome or example of another genre. That's the word I want to highlight. Or it lasts in time. It has posterity value. So basically, literature is seen as something that is not a word you can apply to any text. The telephone directory is not, by this definition, the telephone directory, which of course now has become obsolete, but which was there in my time. The yellow pages. This is given as an example in some text I studied. That's why I remember it. The yellow pages or the telephone directory is not literature. It's just a list of names, with phone numbers against it and addresses and the place where that person lives. And but something like what I told you, Plato's dialogues or the book Phaedrus. I mean that is literature because it was written long ago in Greece, but in 2020 I am still talking about it. So it has, it has a value, the value of lasting, down the ages in time and in spaces. It was written in Greece. I read about it in Thiruvananthapuram, and I'm talking about it, from Saudi Arabia. So it has value enough for at least one person, me, to want to keep it alive even now after so many years. Now, so this is a the broad kinds of categories into which you can define literature. So literature, if you look at historically, people say that literature started, as a kind of storytelling or a record connected to history. So there is oral literature where stories are passed on down the generations. There's visual literature, the cave paintings of Lascaux, Lascaux, which you all know about. I mean, they narrate the history of people, how they hunt, how they, of the hunt, and the cave paintings that appear in the very famous movie, The English Patient, of a people who are very old in Africa. But there's an element of narrativity there. So people divide literature. When they divide literature, they divide it into oral literature, into visual literature, and into written literature. And written literature, like I told you, is divided into any kind of writing being literature, or writing that has value enough to advertently or inadvertently keep itself alive by continuing to be referred to, which is the ideal state that a creative writer, hopes for. He wants to, he has, you can say, a hunger for immortality, the thing that Buddha said is not a good thing. And the immortality he hungers for, he hankers after, he or she, or a group of writers, or whatever. What they hanker or hunger after is that they should be read increasingly, they should be read in different places, they should be translated into many languages, they should be read down the ages, they should live and not die. So you have that, and along with it I also used a lot of words. But now let's look at, now having gone through that sketchy but necessary introduction, let's look at the traditional way of dividing literature. I brought in many words, and I hope you're listening very carefully, because I told you that literature is connected to history, and is connected to time and place and space and times and ages, and it's connected to cultures, it's connected to history, which is also connected to geography, to civics. It's thus, you understand that it does not exist in isolation. It has to exist as part of an element in a network of components structurally, and this network is one that keeps is flexible and malleable, keeps shifting, and keeps changing and evolving or devolving. But at the same time, it has a certain amount of repetitivity. It repeats also, so that there's a certain familiarity that enables us to call it a discourse constant enough to talk of as literature. I hope that's not too complex. I hope that I'm used to putting things in a very simple manner. So how do you divide literature? If we reduce it into being something written that has some kind of value, aesthetic or linguistic, or in terms of language, or in terms of meaning, quantity, hermeneutics, symbology, etc. If we divide literature and we narrow it down, and now we have brought it to saying that it's something, or I have brought it to saying that it's something that must offer me, not that I am the be all and end all of everything or the center. It must offer a large enough set of people something which they call of value, so that they want to keep it alive. And that kind of literature, how do you divide it further? The atom. Are we ever going to find the God particle, or will we find nothingness at the end of it, or everythingness? That is divided into prose and poetry. That's divided into prose and poetry, as you all know. And just to make it more clear to you, poetry is again, a term that is privileged. A better division would be to say it is divided into prose and verse, which is how it was initially divided. When people told stories, as I told you, in the oral tradition, there could be, a storyteller who was using just a story, or the story could be something that could be composed in such a way that it could be sung, giving it the elements of prosody, which is a funny word because, it's about verse or versification, but somehow it sounds like prose. The elements of prosody, and what was sung, from which, and simultaneously there was also magic and ritual, and there were mantras or chants or prayers, or which are repetitive, which are like spells, which are incantatory. And somewhere at the meeting point between those songs and these incantatory spells, in the middle of it, this thing called verse was born. And the higher types of verse, VERSE, okay, not WORSE. The higher types of verse were called poetry, because they used, more sophisticated device of showing or telling. Devices we have come to recognize as Hebrew parallelism or metaphor, metonymy, simile, personification, alliteration, assonance, consonance, onomatopoeia. I mean, things like that. So again, so you have prose on the one side, and if you put it in the oral tradition, and the oral tradition has not died out, because now we have a whole stream of people in oral histories, and they go and record the stories, the individual stories of people who did not write it down. And it's a very important part of our knowledge of ourselves as human beings. So there is an oral tradition itself. There are people who tell stories, and you can say that that's the beginnings of the seeds of prose. And there are people who sing the stories, like the Pullu and Paatugal in Kerala. And from that comes, and of course there are the mantras and the chants and the spells and all that. And then we have verse. Why do I talk of the difference between VERSE, versification, verse, and poetry? You see, it's because in early civilizations that had broken out of what used to be then called primitivism or barbarism, or atavism, or what was called backwardness. Now we don't use those terms, but they were used once upon a time. And civilization, which was about written text, which was about the alphabet and being able to put down things so you could hand it over to people not as something spoken but as something written. And this usually happened in cities. If you take Sumeria, it happened in the city called Babylon, which is one of the earliest civilizations that we know of because of records. And what happened is everything, because it was still moving over from the oral to the written, from speech to text. because it was still moving over, because both these traditions were still alive. The versifiers, they wrote everything in verse. The doctor's prescription, all his medicines, to be carried on to the next generation of apothecaries. The great physicians, they would not write it. They would not write it in prose. The prescription to the druggist or the pharmacist that we take today to the medical shop, which he can't read because no doctors writing. Almost, not everyone. Most doctors, people say, you can't make out what they are writing. Their handwriting is full of indecipherable scrawls. Only the pharmacists or the pharmacologists can make sense of it. The ordinary person can't. Which might be an art developed so that the ordinary person shouldn't know what on earth is being prescribed to him. I don't know. I'm just being humorous, I'm just being humorous here. But what I want to say is, in earlier times, that prescription the doctors made would be written out in the form of a couplet or a 3-liner or 4-liner, so that the person who is going to become the next doctor can easily memorize it. And memory of this kind, which was aided by pattern of having the same number of syllables in each line, of having rhyme, of having alliteration, etc. The sound played a very important element, because it's easier for us to remember. I'm sure all of you remember, a rhyme like "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are, up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky." But you may not remember what you read in the newspaper yesterday. Why? Of course, this has to do with childhood having easier ability, or more ability to have memory power. What you learn in childhood, you retain more, and as you grow older, you lose it. But another fact is the fact that was put in, verse. Those nursery rhymes are verse. Sometimes they are also high poetry, in the sense that they remain with us. We still teach them to our kids, so they have value for us. Yeah, so I wanted to tell you this difference, because when I say prose and poetry, I want you to remember that I say poetry because everything was written initially in verse. And, out of that, only some things were called poetry. So, how do you divide, or can you divide? Can you divide these things? No, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. For example, some people divide prose into fiction, non-fiction, fiction and non-fiction, and drama. But there's a problem here automatically, because we know that fiction can be written also as verse or as poetry. For example, Alexander Pushkin's, Eugene Onegin, Vikram Seth's Golden Gate. I mean, that's fiction, but is also written in verse. And, if you want to argue about it, it's also poetry. So it's fiction. Fiction can be. So, what I want to talk about is, when we divide literature, you have to understand that these divisions are held provisionally, and they go upward and downward. If you write it as a tree, and at the top of the tree you have literature, and above that you have writing, and you have speech and writing, and then you have visual symbols. And hieroglyphics are a form where it's partially writing and partially visual symbols. And even Chinese even Chinese idiolects, it's partially pictures, pictograms, ideograms. So if you start by saying let's talk of writing, let's talk of orality, let's talk of the visual, and then we say literature, and then we divide it into prose and poetry. And then under prose, now this is how people usually do it. Okay, under prose, they put, you know, under prose they put fiction and non-fiction, and under poetry, you know, they put lyric. Let's say they put lyric. Let's start with lyric. But suppose you take something like narrative. Suppose you take something like the epic. You know, where do you put it? Suppose you take something like something bigger, drama. Where do you put it? So you put it in the middle. You put it in the middle. But where is the middle? You know, as I told you, you have to put fiction under prose and you have to put fiction under poetry. And you have to put fiction under drama also, because drama also is a kind of fiction. So yeah, I'm more interested. You know, we are talking about practical criticism, and practical criticism starts with trying to wrestle with terms and concepts and definitions, and being able to move inside and outside of them at the same time. You know, to dwell in a state of peace and calm and quietness in the midst of uncertainty. At the same time, to know how to use these, to understand that these are tools that we can use for reference, for our, you know, ease when we speak of analysis. Yeah. So we have literature as the art of written work, not confined to published sources. It can be unpublished sources. For example, a diary that I write today and keep under my pillow. Tomorrow, you know, someone may take it, and you know, it was unpublished, but he may start quoting it, so enters the public domain, and you know, so that's part of it. And then, you know, let's go to. So I told you oral literature, for example. You know, you think of oral histories, written literature I'll go to. And, you know, visual literature, for example, film can be considered naturally a form of visual literature. Serials, now everyone's speaking about, you know, The Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth, which has been made into a serial. But you can consider it as part of visual literature. You can consider the film which is being trashed, Lakshmi, as part of visual literature. I haven't seen it, or Surya's latest film. Or you can consider, you know, there's a kind of serial on chess. I forgot its name, you know, which everyone is speaking of. I don't know, it's called Natural Gambit or something like that. That's part of visual literature. You know, but let's come to so, you know, so it's widened. That's what I want to talk about. You know, newspapers, encyclopedias, magazines, broadcasting, film, you know, philosophy, law, all this could produce something that we call literature in today's world. Right? Yeah. So now let us look at fiction. I mean, let's look at fiction. Fiction is the form of any narrative or, you know, fiction. Yeah. What do we mean by fiction? And again, I would like to talk about what people usually call as fiction, and you know what they talk about fiction. They just talk of three categories. Okay, when you ask people at the undergraduate level, at the graduate level, you know, they speak of the novel, they speak of the novelette. That's what they call the short novel. So, you know, they may say, sir, War and Peace is a novel. And that's good for you to think. What is the example that you will give? And they will say Old Man and the Sea. Yeah, that's a novella or a novelette. And of course, they will say, yeah, The Last Leaf by O. Henry. That's a short story. And this is their knowledge of fiction. But I want you, that's why, yesterday I had told Appu that, it will be good if you have a pad and pen and paper, because I want to look at it a little more in detail. And, I want to talk about, fiction from the beginning, when things began to be written down. And, the first examples of fiction that we have, which is also what we teach children. That's a fairy tale. That's a fairy tale. And, fairy tales are, there all over the world in different forms. That's why the fairy tale is very important. And the fairy tale, you have Grimm's fairy tales, Jacob Grimm's fairy tales, for example. And you know all about it. You all know about Jacob Grimm's, Grimm's fairy tales. Then as a later development, you have someone like Hans Christian Andersen, developed the form of the fairy tale and who wrote a kind of modern fairy tale. At the same time as Grimm, there was also Perrault, P-E-R-R-A-U-L-T, Perrault, Charles Perrault in France, Perrault's fairy tales. And in India you had, you had the, before the Amar Chitrakatha, which you all know about. I mean, you had things like Jataka tales, and you had, I'm trying to remember that word name, which is slipping from my mind now. You had the very famous, the tales that you have the 1001 Nights in Arabia, where you have tales like, about Sinbad the Sailor. So throughout the world, you have Russian fairy tales, you have Celtic fairy tales, Irish fairy tales, Gaelic fairy tales. You have all kinds of fairy tales in every land and every place. And fairy tales, you can say, when we speak of fiction, which is different from speaking of prose, because when I speak of prose, I have to speak of both, fiction and non-fiction, as I told you. So you have the fairy tale, and you have studies on the fairy tale, from which, people like Vladimir Prop, for example, he developed these very interesting, characters that he says form the basis of all fairy tales, which is a part of, Russian formalism. And Vladimir Prop comes especially to mind when you do an analysis. And after, the fairy tale, you have mythologies. You have mythologies. Now, when we speak of mythologies, that's where I also bring in, something that I have to, you have to bring in the epic. You have to bring the epic too. So on the one hand, you have an epic like the Epic of Gilgamesh. And then you have a modern epic like the Portuguese one by, Camões, which is the Lusíads. And then you have our own, world famous mythologies, the Bible, the Quran, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and, the mythological elements that are there in the Vedas, which deal with Indra and Vak and the Ashwins and Maruts and, the gods of that time. And you have many other epics. You have many other mythologies. And these two are closely tied together. You call it an epic when the mythology no longer has power, in the sense that, people no longer think that those gods are living. So you speak of Greek mythology, you speak of Roman mythology, you speak of Icelandic or, Norwegian or Finnish mythology, you speak of them as epics, because nobody is going to Nobody is going to question you if you say that's an epic. Epic of Gilgamesh. Nobody is going to argue with you and say, no, no, you can't say that Ishtar is dead. But you call as mythologies in a literature class, works I told you about, like the Bible, the Quran, the Mahabharata, and the Ramayana. Those are mythologies. Those are also epic. So mythology is an epic. An epic deals with a mythology, that has currency in terms of referentiality, allusiveness, intertextuality, but does not have currency in terms of being something that is part of a culture now presently of what people practice in their daily lives. I hope that that distinction is clear to you. Yeah? And it's a controversial thing. It's a controversial decision. I mean, I know that what I'm saying is controversial, but I am talking of it purely from the point of view of the literature class. Okay, and then you have what is the next thing that you have? If you talk, you have letters. Okay. Sorry, that comes later in novel. Now we come to a very interesting two things I want to tell you about, which are very interesting. We are still dealing with fiction. Now, when we speak of myth and we speak of the epic, but we also speak about the evolution or history of mankind. And you see that gradually in these myths, initially there were, gods and all powerful gods. But then we see that those gods, they become half human. And gradually the human element in the gods, increases to the point where the element of there being a god slowly begins to recede into the background or become unimportant or die out. And what do we call, those stories? What do we call those stories that came about? We call them legends. We call them legends. Okay. And just like I told you about fairy tales are also interesting in that they deal with, elements of supernaturalism. There are supernatural things in fairy tales. But at the same time, another kind of story was coming up that we call folk tales. And folk tales can be differentiated from fairy tales because, again, of this element. The human element is predominant in a folk tale, whereas the supernatural element is predominant in a fairy tale, as the very title suggests. Fairy tales have fairies in them. So in Kerala, for example, since I don't know where all the audience is from, I do know actually in a way, but I want to take it as directly starting using Kerala as one of the centers of my discussion. And so in Kerala, if you have a story about the Kuttayam, if you have a story about the Ekshi, if you have stories like that, those would be considered fairy tales. But if you take a very famous story in India, like the story of Vikram or Betar, Vikram and the ghost, you can see that the story of the ghost being taken down from the tree and Vikram carrying, and then he tells the story and asks the question, and if Vikram doesn't answer, his head will be blown apart, or if he answers, he will live, but the ghost will escape, and he has to do it all over again. And Arabian Nights kind of framing to keep the story going on and on. Where the woman has to tell a story every day to the king, Shahrazad, or she will be beheaded, but she manages and holds his attention, so he gives her one more night, and like that she lives on, and finally he falls in love with her. But that's about the framing of the story. But what I want to say is, in this framing, what happens is it becomes more of a folk tale, because the relevance shifts to the story told by the ghost, which you have to crack like a murder mystery and give the right answer to, as you identify yourself with Vikram, the human being, although he's a king. And there we are entering, as I told you, the world of the folk tale. It's more of a folk tale than a fairy tale. So when we talk of fiction, now that is our broad overarching, theme. I told you we have fairy tales and folk tales. We have epics and mythologies. We have legends, and it is only after that. It's after that that we come to, legends. When you speak of legends, what do I mean by legends? What are the examples of legends? Yeah, there's King Arthur and the legend of the Knights of the Round Table, and we have our own local legend, the legend of Maveli. That's a legend, and so we have legends, and then we come to what we call the age of enlightenment. When we all became very rational, supposedly, and we became Eurocentric, and we became, people or children of the Enlightenment, and Descartes became a big thing. There, what do we come? After the fairy tale, folk tale, epic, mythology, legends, and all these things that we speak of, where there are elements of divinity, spirituality, gods, goddesses, and supernatural beings, good and evil with powers. There are also lesser beings like fairies and elves, and gnomes and all that, and devils and demons and jinns. And we after we come down to what we call reality, to find out what it's about. Novel. We come to the novel. And I am going a little bit off track to tell you about the history of the novel in England. So I'm making two leaps. One is, I'm coming to the novel, and after that I'm coming to English literature. So England and English literature. I'm making two leaps. So suddenly I'm in the 17th and 18th centuries, and suddenly I'm in England and I'm dealing with English literature. And then what I want to talk about is, the construction of the novel in England. The first famous novel was Pamela or Virtue Rewarded, and which of course was based on the Bildungsroman, or that's a story with a key, to put it in a very simple way. When Pamela was made, I don't know if you guys know about this. The Pamela is an epistolary novel. It's an epistolary novel. It's a novel written in the form of, I know you know about this, that's written in the form of letters, but I don't know if you know about what I'm going to tell you now, because that's a very important point, because we have to deal with this idea of reality and truthfulness and honesty, and the idea of the true story. When Pamela was written by Samuel Richardson, if I remember correctly, people were following it anxiously because it was serialized. It was very popular, and everyone wanted to know about this bad guy, the who starts as a villain and then is an anti-hero and then becomes a hero. He tries to rape Pamela, and Pamela is very much angry and offended with him. But she is the domestic helper, and he is a lord, aristocracy and all that. But gradually, because of her character, she's equated with virtue. She not being a feminist, not thinking that, understanding that a woman is her own center, but being very much in a patriarchal society that values position and power and influence, and considers that everything else is, marriage is the be all and end all of life, for a Christian woman. She secretly falls in love with this guy, and she wins him over with her behavior, and finally he agrees to marry her, and he marries her. And now I come to the interesting part of this novel. When the episode was published in which he married her, people were so thrilled. It was almost like they declared a holiday in England, and people ran out on the streets and they were celebrating. Wow, Pamela got married, and the church bells were rung from the steeples in rejoicing that virtue had been rewarded. So this brings us to the to two questions as someone who wants to talk about practical criticism and analysis. And that question is, just like the Enlightenment was breaking upon the horizon of Europe, and they believed that the novel was the arrival of a new form of writing where fiction would be recognized as what it is, which was a reaction to the examples I told you about, fairy tale and legend and myth and epic, and which was also a subtle question of religious texts, saying let's be done with this idea that these things are really real, that are spoken of in these books. They are entertaining, true, they delight us, they instruct us, but are they real or not? No, we just rather have a story. We just rather have a story that is actually real, where everything that happens in it is something that we can relate to, because it's like what happens around us. No miracles, no unseen beings, and we want that kind of a story. That's what we call a true story. And we also want, but while writing this true story, the true story escaped into being, unrealistic, because people were rejoicing over the marriage of a fictional character. And, that brings in the question, what is there a difference? Or am I imagining it? And maybe I'm entirely wrong. Or is there any difference between me rejoicing over the victory of a hero in an epic, or a heroine over some obstacle or difficulty, and the people of England rejoicing over the victory of Pamela's virtue over the vice, of the villain or anti-hero who is converted into being a hero? And if there's a difference, in what does the difference consist of? What has changed? I'm not saying there's no change. I am saying there is a change. But I am saying that if you say you're a practical critic, you don't have a right to that title unless you can verbalize what that change is. And here we come to another thing, There are two kinds of stories I left out. You all know about Aesop's fables. Aesop's fables. Where stories where animals talk. For example, there's a story of the ant and the grasshopper. And why were those fables written? Those fables were written for grown-ups and children. With a moral. They were written to teach something to the people. So again, I've gone back. See, this is what I told you. When I'm going to deal with literary forms, I'm going to go backward and forward or upward and downward, if you're looking at it as a tree, a lot. Because, there's so much of overlap, but there's no confusion in my mind because I've dealt with all these things for a long time. And if you are getting confused, that's okay, because confusion is the beginning of clarity, because then it forces you to think it through and, come to develop your own clarity and, put it against the whetstone, like Matthew Arnold said, the touchstone method, where you compare it with others, what they say, and you find out whether your clarity is right or wrong, or you're still as confused as ever. So, like I was saying, when Pamela was written, there were three startling things about it. One was that it was written in the form of letters. It was an epistolary novel, which is nothing like what we now consider as the novel. And another thing is, it was written as if it was a fable. It was teaching people a moral. The moral is virtue is always rewarded. So it had a fabulistic element to it. And vice is always either punished, or vice has to become virtue if it wants to continue existing in the world. It was also an exemplum. I want to bring in another word. Exemplum. It was an exemplum. What's exemplum? Exemplum means, it was portraying an example before society, of how a man should be, how a woman should be, to fit into society. The man should behave in a respectable manner to women, and women are, right to resist, advances made by a man towards them, which are unseemly, even if they belong to a lower class, which is lower within quotation marks, but very clearly there the class divide. But the second half might amuse people today who are into theory. The idea that but still it is okay to love that villain and to marry him finally, provided he has turned over, he has stopped sowing his wild oats. He has turned over a new page. I mean, the question remains, if you read the full novel, the question remains whether Samuel Richardson has been successful in portraying the male character's repentance in such a way that we are convinced that he has actually repented. We don't know. It seems very clear that Pamela does not think so. Pamela feels that he has, and that's enough reason for her to, declare that she's ready to accept him as a husband. Yeah. To come back, where do you draw the line? You start out by saying you're talking of the novel, and it is in prose, but it's in letters, and it is also a fable, and it is also an exemplar. And there is something almost fairy tale like about the ending. It's a fairy tale ending. It's a comedy. All's well that ends well, and of course it's not a fairy tale, but it's fairy tale like. I mean, miracles like that seldom. There's a miracle in it. The miracle is that this man changes. So it's supposed to be a total change inside. We are supposed to believe that. So there is a miraculous element, and the most miraculous element, which was not accounted for them, which could be accounted for only much later in theory, after the rise of reader response criticism, and after the rise of new criticism and practical criticism, and after the rise of new historicism or structuralism, post-structuralism, deconstruction, postmodernism, etc., that is, the audience reaction or the reaction of the readers, which could not be taken into consideration then. It was taken into consideration in a very simple way of saying, this is a hugely popular novel, maybe because it's serialized, it keeps the suspense intact. We want to find out what happens next. And it's so popular that, he's such a great writer that he makes you believe. It is true that he's a great writer. He makes you believe in Pamela. Pamela stands out as a very powerful, fully rounded character, as a changing character, as a developing character. It's not a stereotype, but maybe more of an archetype, as not flat, but round, not static, when we do character analysis. Yeah, so, it's true. He pulled it off. He did a wonderful work. It's a fascinating novel, and I can still read it and I can still be entranced by it. But let's look at how the story is told in a different way in another novel by Thomas Hardy, in Tess of the D'Urbervilles. In Tess of the D'Urbervilles, we have again Tess, who's a very innocent girl like Pamela. And Tess is raped by a man called Alec d'Urberville. You know the story, I hope. It was made into a famous film by another man who was, a great filmmaker, but who was a pedophile, and therefore he was rightly isolated. And that's Roman Polanski, the director. But that's a different matter. But to come back to Tess of the D'Urbervilles as a novel, and now we are in an entirely different world altogether. What do we see in Tess? Alec d'Urberville, rapes Tess, literally. And she goes away and she meets Angel Clare, who's very kind to her, who's loving, whom she falls in love with in a way. And he is an atheist. And, he turns her against belief in God. And later, she moves away from him through circumstances, and she meets Alec d'Urberville again. And she finds that Alec d'Urberville is now, has repented and is preaching the gospel of Christ. And she innocently tells him, the atheistic principles that Angel Clare has put into her, telling him there's no God and all that. And he thinks, and he had come to apologize to her, and he had come to say, look, I'm sorry for what I did, and I would like to make reparation for you or to you, something like Tolstoy's Resurrection. He said, and she convinces him, and he says, then why am I, why should I believe in God and Christ and all that? To being what I am. And we know she ends up being hung for murder of Alec d'Urberville, if I remember correctly. So the two words that come to mind are tragic and ironic, but that's not why I told you the story. That statement, which we don't know how to understand it, because it ends with that famous statement by Hardy, which says, the president of the Immortals had ended his sport with Tess. So, I mean, is Hardy an atheist, or is he a believer in a God who is like Shakespeare's, quotation in Macbeth, as flies to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport. So we are in confusion about the narrator's point of view, about what happened in the novel. Was Tess right in telling Alec d'Urberville the ideas of Angel Clare, or was she wrong? Was his repentance real? And when he fell out of it, so is she responsible in a way, or is she not responsible? I mean, there are many questions. Basically, she's not responsible. She's innocent. She's just a person whom, as fate or destiny plays extremely cruel tricks on for reasons unknown. But you see how this theme has traveled across the ages, you know, down 100 or down 100, 150, 200 years, and how it has become transformed. You know, what started as vice and virtue, you know, how it has become complicated in RD into a place where we don't know any longer what to call vice or what to call virtue. And you know how this whole question of how Hardy, I don't know if there's any study done on this, but you know, he inverts, he shows us, he turns Pamela inside out and shows it to us. And it's an excellent, you know, kind of a job, making us really think about the novel. And it makes us think about this question, you know, what is the, it's a novel, we agree, but what is it a fable? Is it an exemplar? So you see the kind of development, the main development that we see when people move from prose to fiction that I am discussing, the main development is towards, you know, a world where God or gods were in the center, and then the universe, the earth, mother nature or nature. What we see is an increasing centering upon the human being, humanism, and also a centering, you know, where first it is patriarchal, but when we come to Tess, when we come to Pamela, that human beings are not just male, but they are also female. And now we come to the novelette, and why shorter forms of fiction came into prominence. As the printing press came into existence and people started to read, initially there was a great interest in reading. But slowly reading skills also developed. And people started developing skills like skimming, scanning, you know, grasping quickly the content of what is read. And a lot of media, if you study Marshall McLuhan has two catchphrases. The Canadian thinker used to be very famous. I don't know if anyone even talks about him now. People of my generation. And you know, those two, oh my God, I have taken more than 1 hour, and Appu, are you there? Appu, are you listening to me? Can you all hear me?
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Yeah, please, you know, tell me how much time do I have?
You can take around one more hour, sir.
Okay. Okay. So, you know, Marshall McLuhan said, and I want to repeat both those things. I'm putting it in a nutshell. One is, he said, the medium is the message. And, you know, he was talking specifically in the light of the arrival of new mediums like print, photography, you know, the arrival of someone like Lumiere, or the arrival of radio, of film and cinema, of negatives, you know, the arrival of the fact that these things could be, you know, things could now be documented, but they could also be tampered with. And, you know, his two catchphrases, which I want you to remember, are the medium is the message, and the second one is the medium is the massage. And this is very interesting because when he says a medium is a massage, what that means is it also brings in Marxism and capitalism and advertising and distribution networks and production and all these things. But what it means is you can start by giving people what you think they should have, but the system around you will force you to a point where you are forced to give people what they think they should have. Massage them. You may start with a novel that is also a fable and an exemplum, but you may have to end with a novel which is not anything like Hardy's. Hardy did not compromise, but you may end by having to write novels where you tell people not what you want to say, not what you think should be the message that they want to hear, but instead they are not going to listen to you if you don't tell them what they think you should tell them. You have to tell them what they think is the moral. You have to tell them what they think is the message. Your fable has to fit their, criteria as an exemplum. It should be an example of what they think it should stand for. And if it doesn't stand for what they think it should stand for, they will tear you down, or they will use your story to mean the exact opposite of what you wanted it to mean, to the point where they will make it an exemplum for what they want it to be an exemplum for, whether it is that or not. This is what it means when we say the medium is the massage. And it is driven by opinion. And we can say it would be simplistic to say it is driven by the opinion of people, meaning the masses. No, there are many factors there. It can be driven by government or state opinion. It can be driven by the opinion of capitalists or corporate houses who are giving the funding. It can be driven by media houses. It can be driven by politicians. It can be driven by groups with vested interest, or with no interest at all, or anarchic groups, or with interests that they think are not vested, etc. Anyway, to come back to it, so as this pressure comes, the pressure, what's the use of being a novelist if no one is going to read your novel? So you have to give people something, and maybe you don't want to compromise on what you want to say, but you may think, so at least let me give them something that they will accept, because it's simple enough, or it's short enough. And you may find examples in tradition. Fairy tales were short, folk tales were short, and more people read fairy tales and folk tales than they read epics. Most people don't read epics. Let's not fool ourselves. Epics are very huge and very difficult to read, even if they are very short. Trying to find people who have actually read Paradise Lost or actually read Epic of Gilgamesh is something like searching for a needle in the haystack. And it's even more difficult to find someone who has read Homer's Iliad or Odyssey, or Dante's Divine Comedy, or Jerusalem Liberata or something. The people don't read the entire Bible. Very few people have. You read these things when it's broken down to you in short bites and bits of information. Everyone has heard the story of David and Goliath, or a large number of people, because it's only one story and easy to take it. But very few people know the entire life of David. Everyone may know Psalm 23, but very few people will know, all the Psalms. Everyone has read Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury in the science fiction world, because it's very short. But everyone may not have read all the works of Ray Bradbury, because that's very long. So, it is dictated in a sense by the world in which we live. Length is problematic in a world that became increasingly busy and frenetic, and became increasingly population from rural to urban landscapes. And so forms like the short novel or novella or novelette came into existence. Now, people who are still quality conscious like Ernest Hemingway, they refuse to compromise in content. So, but they do. But Hemingway was a journalist, so he knew that you want people to read. No point in trying to write like Jacques Derrida, who came later. But anyway, point in trying to write like William Faulkner. So he himself said, Faulkner said about Hemingway, he never sends me to the dictionary. But Hemingway knew that this is a plus point and not a minus point in today's world, because people have no time to go to the dictionary. And they in fact, they don't know how to use a dictionary. Most of them have never, maybe some of them have not even seen a dictionary, and they don't have a dictionary on their mobile phone. They just look it up on Google, only that particular word. And they're satisfied with the first definition they come across. But he didn't compromise on content, but he compromised in terms that when he wrote Old Man and the Sea, not because he knew that more chance of people reading it if it's short. And he did not use difficult words because he knew that as a journalist, if you're short and to the point, and if you write at a level that people can understand you, of getting through to the reader. And so many short novels came into existence. John Steinbeck wrote fantastic short novels like Of Mice and Men, and he wrote The Pearl. And short novels became a genre in itself. The novella or the novelette. Yeah, and you know that so it's about number of words. For example, right now I'm doing NaNoWriMo in USA month, and they give you a target 50,000 words. That's a novel, and that's true. A novel is usually if a publisher has to even look at it, it has to have 50,000 words. So if I write only 30,000 words, 20,000 words, that's considered a novella or a novelette, depending on the content. Yeah, it's a novelette if it deals with anything, and if it is a short story, if it's a short story, we come to an even more sense of condensation, where you deal with only 2 or 3 characters, you deal with only one place or setting, only one time. The time scale or time scheme is limited. You deal usually with only one point of view, maximum 2. You deal only with 1 or 2 themes, not more. So it is a kind of stripping away to the bare essentials of the richness of the novel. So with this, there are 2 more types of fiction I want to deal with. And one is parable, which comes from the parables of Jesus in the Bible. And parables are not like fables. They don't have a moral. They are multi-edged. They can have different meanings. And the typical example given in the Bible is he opened his mouth in dark sayings. So the idea of a parable is that when people are looking to find fault with your words, you tell them a very short story which can be interpreted in many different ways, so that you don't know whether the story is aimed at them or an attempt to help them, that kind of thing. So there are parables, and finally there's allegory. So there are classic allegories. The typical example given is Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, where there's direct one-on-one correspondence between the character and what he or she stands for. Thus, Apollyon stands for evil, Christian stands for Christianity, hopeful stands for hopeful, faithful stands for faithful. A slow of despond stands for slow of despond. Don't become despondent. It's very direct. But it's a fascinating story all the same. So to sum up very simply, In literature, you divide it into prose and verse or poetry, and in prose you have fiction to start with. And I had to deal with fiction, in a bit of a lengthy thing, because there are so many things I wanted to tell you about. And I don't know if anyone has been so comprehensive to you in a lecture before, at the expense probably of something else that I'll have to leave out now. So to come to summarize it, what are the forms of fiction? You have the fairy tale, you have the folk tale, you have the epic in verse and prose, you have the mythologies, you have legends, you have fables, you have exemplums, you have parables, you have allegories, and finally you have novels, novellas or novelettes, and short stories. That's it. Now we go to non-fiction. Non-fiction is, again, speaking in 2020, it's very difficult to speak about anything, okay? Especially if you are into theory the way I am. Now, fiction is called fiction. Earlier, fiction was called fiction because it was supposed to be untrue. I mean, Pamela, we know, did not exist. But now we know that it's not that simple, because Pamela may not have existed, but she lives in England, and England existed. And, lords or aristocrats like the man she's dealing with existed. And ladies like her who are working in the houses of such men existed. So fiction itself is not entirely fiction. Fiction is actually fictional in some of its elements, while some of its other elements, usually like setting or the narrator and his point of view, if he is standing outside the fiction, and themes are not fictional. They are very much rooted in reality. And what is fictional is supposed to be, the setting may be fictional if it is fantasy. The characters are usually fictional, but not always. There can also be historical characters, and characters, point of view, themes, setting, and I don't know what I'm missing, if anything. How do we differentiate? So, closely allied to fiction, as I told you, fiction can be allied to poetry. If you understand, fiction can be written as a verse also. A brilliant friend of mine, Dr. Santosh Bakaya, has written the biography of Gandhi entirely in verse. And she's written a story called Ohark, entirely in verse, narrative. I'll come to that later. A Rosette Sonnet poem, which is a story entirely in verse. So these are all related, okay? Fiction, narrative, non-fiction, and drama. These are all related. That's what I want to tell you. They're all related. And, at the other end is poetry. It's one continuous flow. So non-fiction. So non-fiction, just like fiction, non-fiction is something that is called non-fiction because the degree of so-called truth is more in it than the degree of what is not truth. The author will be forced to reconstruct some elements in the non-fiction work according to his imagination. And, new historicists like Stephen Greenblatt point this out in his book, like about William Shakespeare, where he says, I have reconstructed parts of his life because I had no other choice. Although it's a non-fictional work, so but let's look at it. What's non-fiction? So first you have autobiography. So we have autobiography, and we have a work like My Experiments with Truth by Mahatma Gandhi. We have biography. So we have an example in the essays of Lytton Strachey, and he writes about eminent Victorians. That brings in another form, essays. Then, we have journalism, which appears in newspapers and magazines. And journalism, the weight is given towards factuality and information. It could be about lifestyle, it could be about culture, etc. Then we have journals, and journals can be documents, journaling, things that are happening around, which have a historical bent, or they could be the private thoughts of an individual. The only difference is a journal is something that is kept daily, like a newspaper, and unlike a magazine, which probably appears in a week or in a fortnight. So we have planners. We have planners. This is a new form that a planner can be used. There are many new forms. For example, in acrostics in poetry, John Cage, who's a great musician, he started a form or made it popular called a mesostic, and he took the cookbook, the menu, and he started writing menu poems. So there's always a crossover. Samuel Beckett wrote a poem called PPS, postscript. So that's kind of like epistolary poetry. So there are always new forms coming out. I don't want to go into new forms. Okay, then there are anecdotal narratives. Anecdotal narratives, narratives that deal with anecdotes. What's the form I missed out? The form I missed out. Paul Theroux, for example. Paul Theroux, or even Daniel Defoe in the Plague Years, Lawrence Stern. Many of these people, they have written travelogues. So narratives or accounts by travelers, by Fahian, or other people. Travelogues are a very important part of non-fictional narratives. And what is very interesting now when we look back at accounts of travelogues, a lot of it seems to be fictional. For example, travelogues written by white men, they represent, when they come to lands they called Oriental or exotic, whether it's Africa or Arabia or India or China, they describe animals they have seen and incidents, and which are absolutely fantastical. And yet these are called non-fictional accounts. And why they are called non-fictional accounts is something that we really don't know or can't make out. If you want an excellent okay, so now I need to hurry before I go on to the workshop element. Yeah. Now I come to a drama, because I can deal with it quickly. Drama is divided into tragedy, into comedy, and into tragicomedy. And later, there is also things like historical drama. There are one-act plays. There are dramas purely for performance, like Samuel Beckett's Breath. And here I want to come back to something else, which is structure and form and genre. So traditionally, somehow, novels and even non-fiction, have fallen into Aristotelian categories of saying that there should be an exposition, and then there should be a complication, there should be a climax, and then there should be an unknotting, and finally there should be, a resolution. But when you deal with so this applies, as I said, to novel, novelette, short story, fable, exemplum, short, fairy tale, folk tale, epic, mythology, everything nowadays. And when it comes to drama, there's loosely what is called the unity of method, which again is derived from Aristotle, where they tried to talk about how things should happen in one place, in one time, and if possible to the same set of characters, which was blown apart by Shakespeare, which is what makes him a great playwright, because he didn't care for any of these rules. But that is neoclassical understanding of drama. And finally we come to poetry. And when we come to poetry, we come to Aristotle, and Aristotle divided poetry into lyric, ode, elegy, threnody, tragedy, comedy, epic. According to him, all these things were poetry because all of them, as I told you, were written in verse. They were written in verse. But now as we go forward, now when people talk about poetry, they mean something very different. They talk about things that survived, and what survived is, they say, for example, when you talk of poetry, you go in and you speak of the ballad, because people still write ballads. You speak of romances, which is narrative poetry, because people still write romances. You speak of the lyric, you speak of the sonnet, you speak of the haiku, you speak of free verse. So it's a very different kind of it's a very different kind of classification of categorization of poetry that people do now. You speak of the elegy, you speak of the occasional poem or poem written for an occasion. And I'm winding up for a simple reason. I have taken 2.5 hours. I didn't know, the time just flew. I've taken 2 hours, and I need a break. I'm going to have a little glass of water. I'm going to vanish, but I'm going to come back, because second half is, I want to take a workshop. If Appu will allow me, of half an hour, I will just give 2 questions, and I will read them out very carefully. And I want you to understand, as a teacher or as a student, I want to encourage all the students in my talk who are listening to me now, whether you're undergraduates or graduates, whatever you call yourself, whether you say you're in school or college, whatever you call yourself, whether you belong to American or British English, whether you're postgraduate students or graduate students, whatever you call yourself, whether you're doing MPhil or PhD, or you're freelance researcher, or you're a journalist or lecturer or assistant professor, reader, head of department, principal, dean, whatever you are, what I want to tell you is, all this becomes exciting and practical when we think about things like, if I was teaching an introduction to literary forms, wanting my students to apply it in practical criticism, what sort of a course would I design? What would I include? Would I teach only the novel? Would I teach only the sonnet? Would I teach only tragedy? And would I limit it to that if it is a BA course? And why? Would I bring in only the essay from non-fiction? And why? And how? And what are the texts that I will use? So if you connect it to course design, it gets connected to practical criticism. So try to design your own course. Go home and try to design your own course. Use any format you find for course design on, and you try it. And then another question is, what sort of what do you aim at? Basically, what is the aim? What sort of questions would you when you analyze literature? Please go to Encyclopedia Britannica. There's a fantastic introduction by Kenneth Rexroth. Kenneth Rexroth is a very famous critic on how you define literature, whether you agree with it or not. But what sort of questions? What are your aims when you teach literature? What are your aims when you study literature as practical criticism? Now, this is a very good question. This is a very good question. And I want to give a few aims. That is, discourse patterns. When you analyze a text, these are the things to look for. What are the patterns of discourse you find? Then, genres. What are the genres that you are touching upon. For example, I told you that Pamela is a novel, but Pamela is also epistolary, Pamela is also fable, Pamela is also exemplum, and Pamela is also allegory. That's, that shows I know my genres. Then language competence. So discourse patterns, genres, language competence, communication skills. Then integrated approach, literacy skills, reading, writing, speaking, listening. And finally, critical thinking skills. So, what are you going to analyze? You say practical criticism. What are you going to analyze? Not at the BA level. This is slightly higher. And these are the things, what are the critical thinking skills you are going to use to analyze? What are the literacy skills you're going to use? What is integrated about your approach to a text? How much is your communicative competence? How much is your language competence? What are your communication skills in presentation, in reading, in speaking, in listening, in writing? Do you know your genres? And most of all, do you know how to deal with discourse? Now I'll give you an example. I wanted to take a break and drink some water, but I think I better think about these examples, and I will close in 25 minutes. Now, let's take, for example, a prose. I'm reading a prose text. Okay. I'm sorry. As a teacher, you develop some habits, like saying okay, etc. Please forgive me for those things. Here's a prose text. There were mosquitoes everywhere when the rain came. John found some in his shoe. On the cooking pot, and their father found several in his car. The whole village was infested with mosquitoes. This situation made the whole village call a meeting. They had a debate. How would they get rid of the mosquitoes? Every person got a chance to speak, and everyone listened carefully. The people discussed each of the suggestions made by both the wise and the foolish. However, none of the ideas was good enough. Then an old woman who was sitting at the edge of the group put up her hand. She told the villagers that in a small bush far away near Benue River, there was a plant with anti-mosquito odor. It was a magic herb. When it was burned, the smell attracted all mosquitoes to the fire. The people decided that this was an excellent idea, so they sent 3 people to get the plant. Now, here is a passage. And, you ask yourself, it's a very small passage. You ask yourself, you are doing practical criticism with this passage. Practical, I mean lemon squeezer criticism, I mean close reading of the text, etc. And you have to ask yourself some questions. What are the most important points in this passage? Can you summarize the passage, into your own sentences? What do you think it talks about? Who do you think the author might be? What do you think is the time it was written in? Why do you think it was written? When, where, why, how, what for? Who is saying this? To whom is it being said? What could be the intent and the motive? And you also look at the stylistic elements. Are there any figures of speech? Is there any kind of a rhythm in the language? Why are those figures of speech being used? What is being privileged? What is being set to the side or marginalized? Is it an attempt to try to say that old people with traditional knowledge of the places they live in have more wisdom than people who are younger, who have ideas, who have a lot to say, but who don't really know the answer to questions? So is it being traditional, or is it upholding ethnicity and culture? And here, what do we come to? We come to, analyzing discourse patterns. That's what I'm telling you. We come to analyzing discourse patterns. And it's not enough to analyze. Do you have the communicative competence to put it across to others? what you have understood or grasped as, practical critic. Are you equipped for that? Do you have the language skills? Do you have the literacy skills inside, including the ones by which you know how to read this text? What is the frame you will give to the text? Will you read it in a deconstructive manner? Will you read it in a structural manner? Will you read it as a student of postmodernism? Will you read it as a reader response theoretician? Will you use queer theory, crip theory, disability studies? Will you use affect studies? What are you going to use? You have a range of tools. You have to decide. You have to come to grips with the text in your own way. And of course, finally, you may or may not face an exam in the question, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is, that you expand your knowledge and territory of understanding, analysis, interpretation, of looking at it semiotically, hermeneutically, of looking at it substantially, of looking at it in terms of semantics, in terms of symbology, of looking at it in 100 different ways, so that you enrich yourself in terms of how to criticize the text. And when you talk, people recognize that they have come across somebody who has taught himself well or herself well, or whatever gender you want to belong to, as to how to read a text, as to how not to read it, as to how to read it inside out, outside in, being both in and out of the text. And this is the sum and substance of practical criticism. Yeah, that's it. I'm stopping because I'm really tired. My throat, I need some water. And I hope that this has been a good session for you.
Well, sir, that was a wonderful session, and thank you so much, sir, for the insightful lecture on practical criticism and literary forms. Dear participants, now it is the time for the question and answer session. You can post your questions in the YouTube chat box. Sir, I will read out the questions for you once it is done. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, sir.
Do you mind if I vanish for 2 minutes?
No, sir.
I just need to, it's been a long time. I need a drink of water, and I just come back in 2 minutes. Huh?
Yeah, sure, sir. And the question is,
Okay.
postmodern period has blurred the margins between literary forms. The relevance of form itself is questioned. What do you think about it?
That's what my whole talk was about, right? I mean, that is precisely the problem that I was wrestling with throughout my talk. It's a good question, so I will answer it. I mean, what do you, because I didn't deal with very recent developments or trends. I mean, what do you do with a world where on the one hand, you have science fiction, you have fantasy, you have steampunk literature, and on the other hand, you have, Twitterature, which is literature written on Twitter. You have blogs. You have, what's that site that's very famous? You have sites like Reddit, sites like Dig, D-I-G-G. You yourself know. I mean, and there is YouTube, there is Instagram, there is Facebook. Now there's a new one called PARLER, Parler, which is becoming very famous in the world because American right is taking it over, and probably other rights will follow, rights or wrongs. And there is so much happening. There are graphic novels, there are comics, there are manga texts. So what do you mean by form? It's a troubling question. My whole topic itself, I told you that these forms blend and merge and also separate. They are like the waves of the sea. They crash into the land and they go back and they come again and they recede. So it's not so clear, but at the same time, the job of a critic is not to be frightened by so-called application of the word postmodern, but to keep trying to navigate these differences and not try to give up classification or categorization in the same way that a scientist does not give up categorizing and classifying things in nature, because he has found out that it's useful. So here too, it is useful. It is useful for me to read William Gibson, his Neuromancer, and to recognize it as part of science fiction, but also part of dystopia. And the same with William Kotzwinkle's Dr. Rat, and to see it as part of the dystopic tradition and as part of science fiction. Because how else can I, as a critic, do my work of analytical, practical criticism, which is also helpful, as can be seen from the fact that non-fiction and critical works are now gaining a kind of readership due to academia, which it did not have earlier. A huge number of people are, whether these things make sense or not, are consumers of such literature, of meta literature, which was earlier called secondary literature, of criticism. Stop trying to classify and categorize. Whether we live in a world where the boundaries between form are being blurred or not. Thank you. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, sir. We have another question from Apu sir. And the question is, in a world of varying literary theories and varying genres, is there a future for a practical critic?
There is a there's a question here as to the definition of what you mean by a practical critic. If by practical critic you only mean the same old narrow definition that was given to it by those who speak of F.R. Lewis and the tradition of the novel, and Ken Warren and Austen, and who speak of I.A. Richards and William Emerson, no, don't have any future. But if by practical critic you mean someone like me, who is even now excited and interested in catching up on the latest theories like Anthropocene and symbiotic literature, and things that I was already doing, or many of us were already doing earlier on, but that are now, even in criticism, being classified and categorized. If you mean people like us who are wide enough, deep enough, large enough, broad enough, high enough, low enough to gather it all in and integrate it and use it in our analysis of whatever we want to study, which itself is not just text anymore in the Derridian sense, but things both inside and outside text, things that include pure performativity, things that include slam poetry, spoken word, anything. I mean, things that include mime, where no words are used at all. Yeah, I mean, then practical critics, I mean, now is your time. Today is your day. I'll give you a simple example. I brought out a book in 2012 or 2013 called A Treatise on Poetry for Beginners. And it did well by my, knowledge of things then, in the sense that, some 100 people read it. And it had a reprint and some another 100 people or 150 people read it. But you see, when I gave it free on ResearchGate and on Academia Edu, and I put it up only in 2018, and now it's just 2020, not even 2 years since I put it up free. I found that more than 3,000 people have read that book, A Treatise on Poetry for Beginners, which is more like a booklet, which is more like just a pamphlet. And these are not ordinary readers. So academicians they have read the full thing. And they have not just read some pages, full thing. So, there is and I am a very old-fashioned critic. I actually come from the world of practical criticism. Structuralism onwards, it is difficult for me to wrestle with because I come from that older world. So there is definitely a place for it.
So there is another question from Amida Vinod. The question is critical appreciation of a literary work can be connected to practical criticism?
Can we, I think, the answer was in the previous answer, but let me look at it once again in a different way. You use the word critique. For example, Immanuel Kant has a famous book called The Critique of Pure Reason, which strangely enough turns out to be, an appreciation of pure reason. It's actually a critique of irrationality, not of pure reason. Anyway, that's a different matter. But you have this word critique, you have the word literary appreciation, you have this term literary appreciation, you have the term literary analysis, you have the term critique, you have the term that you are now bandying about as if it's a narrow thing, practical criticism. We are bandying about, including me in this talk. What I want to say is these things are not contradictory to each other. Okay, you can't do practical criticism without also doing some level or amount of literary appreciation, and you can't do literary appreciation into the details, which means you are forced to do some amount of practical. If you can do it and show it to me, I will be pleased to see it. I mean, a friend of mine told me, you can take a poem and study it in terms of William Emerson's 7 Types of Ambiguity and say, this is an incredible poem because it includes this poem includes in it all the 7 types of ambiguity. To say, I am surprised that it includes all the types of ambiguity in it. Implicitly, you are ascribing value. You have moved from practical criticism to literary appreciation, and you can't divide it, both these things. So I hope I have given an answer.
So the next question is from Miss Yudi. The question is, can we do away with the well-defined literary tools and look or study or analyze at a work of art our own way?
I mean, nothing stops you from doing it. But there's something called validation in today's world, and there's something called valorization. To use jargon, the thing is, if you just go to a text and you just say what you want to say about it, you are doing the oldest kind of literary criticism there is on earth, which is that it's just a direct encounter between you and the text without any seemingly any background in knowing how to encounter a text. Seemingly you don't have any tools, and you just say what you want to say. You say it's good, you say it's bad, you say I like it for this reason, I don't like it for that reason. But the thing is, will it be validated? And will it be valorized by somebody or the other? If there's no validation for it, what I mean is, at the first step, will somebody read it? And at the second time, when people read it, will they say, yeah, you also say something which makes some sense to us, which is meaningful, which is useful for us? Or will they say, No, this is just somebody, who wanted to escape the easy route, escape the difficult route of learning about literary theories and criticism, and instead opted for the easy way out, and therefore just says anything he or she likes about anything he or she wants, and it has no depth, and much of it is far-fetched. So we train ourselves simply because however much we say we don't live in a society, we want validation, and we want some people to valorize what we do by saying it's good.
Sir, this question is from Vaishali Barwa. The question is, how would you use the tools of practical criticism to read cultural text? Example, an artifact or a piece of musical composition.
And this is a very good question. This is a very good question. In fact, I I knew this question would come up, and so I mean, let's look at let's look at it. As I told you earlier, when Pamela was brought out, people were looking at it in terms of, I feel happy that Pamela got married. But now you have to, you can't see. As I told you, we study not only literature, but we study not only fiction and non-fiction. We also study music as a cultural text. We study cinema. We study visual art. We study painting, sculpture. We study all these things. Now, what exactly do we study when we say, we study them because of the relevance of cultural studies. Okay, we have to connect literature, literary forms, cultural forms, and popular culture is a very big part of it. Pop art is a very big part of it. What do we mean by that? I mean, we need to look at not only a genre, but we need to look at its politics. We need to look at not only a canon, but we need to look at its politics. We need to look at what we mean by cultural forms as opposed to literary forms. Starting with Marxist criticism, in a way you can say, why we ask questions like, why does an author choose a certain form? Are some forms bourgeoisie? Are some forms proletarian forms? I spoke about the Pullu and Pata. Pullu and Pata, is it something? It is cultural, definitely. It belongs to the Pulluans community, Pulluan community. I mean, culturally speaking. Now, if I look at it, I mean, is it proletarian or is it bourgeoisie? If you look at it in terms of Marxist, criticism, what are the factors outside the purview of the text as a literary act? Readership, publication, production, reception of the text, who reads it, why, when, where, how. And this is all very important when we look at why are some texts chosen as representative, why are some texts able to become bestsellers, why are some texts prescribed, why are some texts not prescribed, why are some texts removed from the syllabus after having been prescribed once, why were some never prescribed, why are some texts introduced freshly, who makes these decisions, where? And a lot of it has to do with multiculturalism and the digital revolution, even the coming of things like data analysis and artificial intelligence. So we cannot really isolate it just to practical criticism. We have to bring these things into practical criticism in a different way. It's a, for example, if you take Ambedkar University, they teach Bob Dylan songs, they teach Bulle Shah. They look at Picasso and Vincent van Gogh, and they also they look at films like Bicycle Thieves and Fiddler on the Roof. They bring in if you look at schools of it, that's why I said to read to read Kenneth Rexroth. Kenneth Rexroth in Encyclopedia Britannica, where he gives a brilliant introduction to literature. And he talks about culture, the development of culture, stereotypes, archetypes, symbolic realities enshrined in religion and myth, archetypes of universal human experience. Is there something like that? We can't, when we deal with themes, is there something called a common psychology? Is there something called a common physiology? What about trauma? What about embodiment in trauma? What about disembodiment in Beckett? What about disability? What about different ability? What about LGBTQIA? So yeah, so practical criticism has to expand if it needs to take these factors into consideration. I saw a very interesting study yesterday, and that very interesting study was, about how children's literature in America that deals with talking animals never represent, talking animals are anthropomorphic. That is, when you talk about the ant and the grasshopper, ultimately you're talking about an industrial person and a lazy person. One who spends whilst away his time singing and playing and dancing music and all that, as if all that is not meaningful, and one who, gathers food for the future and all that. But, this very interesting study talks about the representation of animals in American children's literature written by usually white people, how these animals never represent blacks or Asians or Mexicans, BAME, or Mexicans, or immigrants. Very interesting study. So you see, we have to move with the times. This is on the basis of textual analysis. So it is practical criticism.
Sir, here is the last question for you. The question is from Madhavi S. Was the evolution of practical criticism more slow paced, overcoming the earlier aspects of literary criticism? And how it is likely to be evolving in the future?
I don't think it was slow paced. If you study the history of practical criticism, and I'm dealing with the early, its early beginnings, the ground for it was laid by Matthew Arnold and Thomas Arnold, who was principal or headmaster of rugby or something like that. And when Matthew Arnold wrote his books, Function and Anarchy, Culture and Anarchy, The Function of Criticism, The Study of Poetry, he was laying the grounds for practical criticism. When he, when he spoke of something called the touchstone method, and the idea that you can take just a sentence from a great writer, of course not any sentence, but a sentence that is considered quotable, quoted much and all that. And he said on the basis of that sentence, you can judge whether he's a great writer or not. And on the basis of another such sentence, you can judge that another writer is not so great and not worth preserving in culture. And he brought in the idea that poetry and literature is a new kind of replacement for the crumbling edifice of religion because of Darwinism, Freudianism, Lutheranism, and because of one more person, very important, Darwin, Freud, Marxism. So he was laying the groundwork, and then it suddenly exploded on the world. If you look at the history of practical criticism, I'm sorry, it was something engineered by in England by the academics of Oxford and Cambridge and a few universities like that. And it happened very suddenly, that they were in classes and classrooms, and it was carried on, of course, in America by people like Stanley Fish and Wolfgang Isser later in reader response criticism and all that. But basically it was the fact that they were suddenly dealing with the proletarianization of the classroom, where there were a lot of students coming in who were not aristocrats, but who were newly rich or who are not even rich. And these people didn't really have a background in what they call the classics in Greek, in Latin, in the Bible, or in Koine, or Aramaic, or anything of the sort. And they knew something about English literature. Maybe they had read bits and pieces of the King James Bible and Shakespeare and some Wordsworth and Coleridge. And they with the situation in the classroom, practical criticism emerged. People think it emerged as a kind of scientific laboratory experiment to uphold reason and all those things. But that's not only reason. The reason was that faced with the classroom situation, it's so much more easier to teach poetry in terms of what's the significance of the title, metaphor, personification, simile, what are the themes, what's the intent, does the poet achieve his intent, and what's the point of view here, and things like that. That's easier in a way than teaching literature in the way in which teachers in Kerala, for example, there was a teacher called C.A. Shepherd in UC College, and I saw recently the notes made by a student while attending his class, and I was astounded at the depth both of the teacher and the student. I mean, my mind boggled at how he was covering Shakespeare, and he had given a list of all the plays of Shakespeare and the different ways in which they could be classified. And that's not practical criticism. That's an entirely different level of criticism. And how will it progress? How has it progressed? It has progressed primarily, as far as I know, because CBSE and in India, for example, CBSE and to some extent ICSE, ISC, and Cambridge Advanced and AS and IGCSE levels are there. International schools have, baccalaureate, and and so it has also seeped upwards into our BA, MA, and around the world because of the influence and clout of American and British universities. So it has progressed very rapidly into being the kind of thing that you do in classrooms across the world. And what will its future be? I feel that if we continue to have teaching as a lecture method in classrooms where academia is concerned, its future will be that it will remain, because it's a very powerful tool to use in a small span of time, in 1 or 2 hours, or in a course, in a semester course or trimester course. But if we expand teaching into blended learning and into its real form, where it will melt away into being a part of our life, we all teach ours. I think practical criticism may not last; it will die out unless it aligns itself with other disciplines in criticism I told you about, like new developments.
Well, by this, our question and answer session has come to an end. Thank you, sir, for taking the time to patiently answer all the questions. And also, I thank the participants who have come up with questions of a varying nature. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Rahul
so much.
Suresh, my classmate, will propose the vote of thanks now. Over to you, Rahul.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. Thank you. Greetings to all those who are gathered here. On behalf of CMS College and the organizing committee, I have immense pleasure in proposing the vote of thanks. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. A.V. Koshi from Jazan University, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, who spoke extensively about literary forms. I also express sincere thanks to our principal, Dr. Wagi C. Joshua, and head of the department, Professor Senior Rachel Matthew, for their great support and encouragement. The participants of today's session, I extend immense gratitude to the convener of this program, Dr. Apu Jacob John, to its course director, Dr. Anju George, and to Professor Anju Kurian, who gave the welcome address. My gratitude also overflows to all the wonderful participants of today's session, to the compare and my classmate Alina Mariam Riju, and the faculty of the English department of CMS College. Once again, a big thank you.
Thank you so much, Rahul. And with that, we have come to the end of today's session. As you all know, our 3-day workshop on the practical critic will end by tomorrow. We'll have Dr. Anirudh Sridhar from the University of Oxford as our main speaker. He will speak to us about practical criticism and close reading. So don't miss tomorrow's session. Thank you all and thank you so much.